Hey everyone, my name is Charles Gauthier. I'm the President and CEO of the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association. Welcome to the fourth session of our weekly webinar series, DVBIA Members Helping Members. We're so glad you can join us online today. If you've been on a DVBIA webinar before, you'll know some of our technical aspects of how we operate. But before we jump into our content, I'll quickly walk through that process for those of you who are joining us for the very first time today. You'll notice that all participants currently have their microphones on mute. We ask that you submit your questions in writing today via the Q&A feature. To access the Q&A feature, you can hover your cursor over the main screen. If you're in full screen mode, you'll see it listed at the bottom of the Zoom window. Our presenter will be addressing your submitted questions after her presentation, but please feel free to submit your questions at any point. And now let's get into today's programming. Today's topic is presented in partnership with Elettra Communications. Elettra's managing partner and co-founder Gwen Hardy will be leading our programming and answering your most pressing questions. Gwen has over 20 years of experience in public relations and communications, and throughout the course of her career, she's worked with a wide variety of clients across many different industries. In her work with Elettra, she has done everything from conducting media relations and developing crisis communications plans to organizing awards galas and advising municipal election campaigns. Gwen sits on the board of the Vancouver Police Foundation, and she is also on the board of directors of the Downtown Vancouver BIA. She has been a member of the DVBIA board of directors since 2018. We're so fortunate to have her expertise and input in the work that we do downtown. And now, without further delay, I'll hand it over to her to take us through her presentation. Over to you, Gwen.
Thanks, Charles. I'll just share my screen here. Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak today and talk about staying strategic and communicating during this COVID time. Just walking through, whoops, we just seem to be not moving on my slides here. Hang on just a sec. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just in terms of the agenda, what we're going to cover today is looking at the current communications landscape, so what's going on around us today, and what are some considerations for communicating during this COVID time. Also, for organizations who are interested in engaging in media relations, taking a look at what's newsworthy and how is that different during a pandemic, and also talk about some tips for pitching the media at this time. I know some organizations are going full tilt right now, but some also have some downtime. So we're going to take a look at how to leverage that downtime and how you might kind of take advantage of some time while we wait for things to get a little bit more back to normal. And also take a look at planning your communications for a gradual reopening. So to start things off and taking a look at the current landscape, I wanted to draw your attention to a recent poll that came out last week. And this is done by IMI International, who's an international marketing firm. And they found that 2/3 of Canadians are tired of COVID-19 information. So this for me is really fascinating because I think as communicators, we have been spending a lot of time being very transparent, sharing a lot of information, with all of our audiences, and really we're seeing that people are starting to get really fatigued by all of the COVID information that's coming at them. Canada's not out of line with the global average. We're looking at 66%. Some countries are more tired than us and some are more receptive. But it's really important for us to understand that when we are communicating right now, this is the environment and this is where the audience is at. So I took a little screen grab here of my inbox the other day, and I'm sure yours might have looked similar a few days back, but it does feel like everybody I ever gave my email address to has sent me some urgent information about what they're doing around COVID. And frankly, this is overwhelming for people. Some of this information is very actionable for me. It was very valuable, but much of it wasn't. So, you know, I send this today just to remind you of your audience and how they're feeling, and to remind you of where your communication is landing. So what are some considerations from that? So the IMI report felt that today it's better to do nothing than to feel pressured to act without value. And I think the really important word there is value. So whether that's today during COVID or whether it's during regular times, we really need to come back to thinking about our audience. what information is it that they need? What do they need to hear? What do they want to hear? How can it be engaging for them? And just really being aware that when you're sharing information, that information needs to have a clear benefit to the audience. Now, the other thing for you to consider is whether or not you want to be reactive or proactive with your communications. So it's going to depend on what information you're sharing and the nature of your organization. But some information, some people are going to want, for example, to find out your COVID protocol information. They're going to want to go deep into that. So you should have that information available for them. But again, depending on the nature of your business, that may not be something that you need to email to absolutely everyone you have done business with. So, as we think about reopening, we are going to think about engaging our audiences more and talking about our protocols, but just think hard about who needs to know that information and what the best way to get it to them is. Is it to have it available when they want to pull that information, or should you be pushing it out to them? My last point here is just around authenticity. And I think now kind of more than ever, we need to be authentic in our communications. And if you haven't engaged in the general conversation around COVID-19 at this point and you're thinking about jumping in, just be aware that the way that you're jumping in doesn't look opportunistic and it's coming from a really authentic place. So switching gears and talking about media relations for a few minutes here. What is newsworthy in a pandemic? So for organizations who are wanting to engage in media relations right now, it's important to know that the bar for news is much higher than it was before. And actually all of 2020, the bar for news has been pretty high. It's been a pretty hard-hitting news year. But I have a little illustration here. A couple of weeks ago, there were some journalists who were all sharing on Twitter all of the terrible pitches that they had been receiving that were really inappropriate during a global pandemic. So clearly Kelly with her sugar baby pitch, I'm not sure if this was news outside of COVID, but certainly in the middle of a global pandemic, it wasn't. And as a communicator, the last thing you want is journalists reacting really negatively to your pitches. So just be mindful that your organization's reputation is on the line here when you're engaging with media. So have a good understanding of what is actually newsworthy. And if it's not really newsworthy, then maybe think twice about pitching. So you have a COVID-19 story, but just because you have a COVID-19 story doesn't mean that it's automatically news. So why? So again, that hard news piece, we are seeing these ongoing waves of hard-hitting local and international, national news every day. We've got government officials coming out making major program announcements. We've got the COVID impacts, the health impacts, all of the stories going on. And then, you layer into that, gun violence in the Maritimes, we've got a helicopter crash, and we've got lots of loss of life. So there's a lot going on in the newsrooms right now, and you really need to know that. But the newsrooms themselves have also been hit hard by the economic downturn, and they are struggling with fewer resources. Now, this has been a story for the last, 5, 8, 10 years that those newsrooms have been having those cuts, but they're really feeling it acutely right now. So we've seen recently publications such as the Vancouver Courier stopping their print edition. The North Shore News, for example, where I live, we're down to 1 a week. Some industry publications, my team was pitching last week and getting bounce back saying they're on hiatus. And others are laying off staff. So really knowing that there are fewer people in those newsrooms who have the capacity to respond to your pitches, that are there to pick up the phone, and that are there to write that story about you. The other piece too, though, is that there's lots of competition. So a lot of organizations are out there pitching stories about what they're doing during COVID. Maybe they've got some great business solutions to help people out, or maybe they're making donations and they're trying to get some coverage of that. So just know that there are a lot of organizations out there as well pitching. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't opportunities. So there are. Readership right now is extremely high, and outlets are looking to feed their readers' appetites for news. So they really are looking for really good stories, but they're looking for compelling stories. So they've got to be good if they're going to run with them. I've got a little screen grab here of Charlie Smith from the Georgia Straight last week. Time to crowdsource. I have less than 55 hours to come up with 3 tech stories, 3 education stories, and 3 real estate stories. Please DM any tips. So reporters really are looking for stories. They don't have a lot of bandwidth. So, sometimes they're looking for help to come up with the ideas for those stories. But just make sure that you're being really aware of where you're pitching, that's appropriate for the audience of that media outlet. But also be ready with strong visuals to support your story. So right now it's tough to get visuals to accompany stories. Not so much happening in the real world. There is a real opportunity if you've got some strong visuals to accompany the story that you're pitching. Now, I want to talk for a couple minutes just about newsworthiness in general. And this applies outside COVID as well as the time that we're in right now. We talk about there being 5 factors around newsworthiness. And you've got to perform well, at least in 2 of these categories to make if you're going to hope to make it on the news and get a story written about you. So the first one is timing, and that plays into the word news. Why is this news today? Something might be more relevant today or this week than next week. For example, with the agriculture announcement yesterday, it would have been a great time for agriculture and COVID stories. So just thinking through how the timing plays into your story. Significance refers to how many people are impacted. So the more people are impacted by a story, the more newsworthy that story is. Proximity is about, how close the story is to home. Vancouver stories are going to be, more newsworthy here necessarily than they will be in Toronto or elsewhere. Prominence refers to high profile people or celebrities. Anytime you've got somebody high profile who's connected to your story, that is going to make it more newsworthy. Now, human interest, we're probably all familiar with the human interest stories, and those are the stories that really delve into how people are impacted, and maybe they're good news stories, maybe they're quirky stories, but that human interest element. So if you can hit on at least 2 of those, and the more the better, you're going to have a good gauge of whether or not media will be interested in your story. I'm just trying to think of an example this week. You may have seen Ryan Reynolds, who delivered an address to the KITS grad class of 2020, that was coverage here. He's a prominent person. Proximity, it was to, the KITS grads. But not only did it impact the KITS grad class, there are a lot of grads across the province who are having a very unusual grad season. So that's particularly relevant right now. So you can kind of see how that hit a number of those, and that's what made that a news story. So some considerations, if you are pitching what I would call softer news, and I know some of the organizations who are attending today are probably going to be dealing with hard-hitting news as well, but for the softer news stories, media are going to be more likely to pick up on your pitches if the information and the pitch is really targeted. So think about the media outlet. So is something, are you going to pitch it a little bit differently to business in Vancouver than you might to the Vancouver Sun or to CBC, just thinking through more of a business audience or more of a layperson audience? Is your pitch really informative? Are you sharing information or tools or resources that are going to help people during this COVID-19 time? We're seeing that there's getting some good pickup on that stuff. And is your pitch, does it have an element of generosity? So we want to be careful about looking opportunistic or anything that's overly promotional. Just because you have a new product or service that you're offering during this time doesn't make it news, but is there an element of generosity in there? Or does your pitch address the COVID-19 impacts in an interesting, different, or potentially significant way? So is it something we haven't seen yet? Is it something that there haven't been other stories written about? For example, if you're donating N19 masks, we've seen lots of stories around that. So what's new? How can you act, or what can you offer that's different? Now, I'll also say that if you do have budget, I might get you to consider a paid ad as well. So that's going to guarantee that your message is going to run. But the media outlets, as I mentioned before, have been hit during this challenging time. And if we want these media outlets to be there for us post-COVID, if you have the ability to run an ad and support a local media outlet, I would encourage you to do so. So just want to run through a couple of examples here, and I'm not affiliated with these companies in any way, but they're just examples of organizations that I thought have done a pretty good job of media relations and found some neat opportunities to generate coverage. And London Drugs, I've seen a couple of times, so really a big shout out to them. The first was around the Girl Guide cookies. So when this COVID period started and the Girl Guides realized they weren't going to be able to go door to door selling cookies, and they had all this stock, London Drugs really quickly stepped up and offered to sell the cookies in their stores and sell them online. And they got a lot of kudos for that. So that was a quick decision that they made. And they ended up really getting some great coverage out of that while helping a great organization across the province. Also, this past week, they created a special aisle for local businesses to sell products. So for local entrepreneurs who are challenged to sell their product during this time, they're opening up shelf space for them within their stores. So it's a COVID-tied story, but there's a real element of generosity, and it's also different. It's something that we haven't seen before. So a couple more examples from smaller organizations. The first one on the left here is it's a prop rental company. I think they do props around weddings. And obviously the wedding season has been really impacted by the limits on gatherings. And so they did a quick pivot, which is obviously a word we're getting very familiar with right now, and partnered with an AV company, a caterer, a photographer, videographer to offer these virtual wedding packages. So a bride and groom can go in and they can connect with all of their guests using technology. They have a caterer who delivers food to all of the guests. So a really different kind of offering. Now, this story is promotional. It's companies, trying to sell a package, but it's also different, and it plays into the sort of, we're starting the wedding season right now, and all of those brides and grooms who are having to adjust their plans and figure out ways to get married when they can't have a big group together. It's really meeting the needs of those people. So there was a real interesting, different take on that story, and that's where that got picked up. And then the last one here is a photographer who had been going around and taking photos of people outside their homes, and they're called portraits, so Porchtraits, and raising money for children's hospitals in Vancouver. And this one, it's an individual, and she's doing a really nice thing. It plays into a larger theme. We've seen this idea of portraits around North America, and this is the kind of Vancouver take on it. So again, that element of generosity, it's been something that people have enjoyed doing during COVID, and it's all been in for a good cause. So in terms of the downtime, so you may be going flat out and this may not be relevant to you, but if you have had to cancel a number of things and you find yourself with some unexpected downtime, now might be a good time to tackle some things on your communications to-do list that can be really hard to get to. So the first one I would suggest taking a look at is how you're connecting with your people. So because people are working remotely and we're not all tied together, you may want to look at your intranet, your employee portal, how you're collaborating, your collaboration software, how you can leverage that. Maybe you need to make some investments in that. Maybe you need to improve some of the governance, some of the functionality, but it may be worth spending some time on those tools. Now, the second one, I would suggest a website update. So sometimes that's something that we know we need to get to, but we never have time. But take a look at your website right now and look at it with some fresh eyes. And maybe you need to tweak the copy to reflect how your business is changing during COVID, or maybe you want to try to tackle a whole new site to really position you for moving forward. But suggest you kind of take a look at that site. You could also engage in a social media audit. So look around at your competitors, look around at some peers that you admire, get some inspiration, and also take a deep dive into your own social. So often we can get tied up in feeding the beast of social media and just focusing on getting the content up. We're not always focusing on how that content is performing. So get into the analytics, get into the back end, and see how you're doing on the engagement front. How is your engagement rate? What is your audience engaging in? What can you learn about? What kind of pictures are grabbing people's attention? What kind of stories are grabbing people's attention? And that can inform your content calendars moving forward. You may also want to revisit your mission, your vision, and your values. Maybe your business has changed. Maybe they're not as relevant today as they were, or maybe the world that we're operating in right now is forcing a change to all of those. Maybe they just need to be freshened up. So take some time, take a look at your mission, your vision, your values, and then you may want to think about a rebrand. We're going to get into a very competitive phase as we start to reopen. There's going to be a lot of people fighting hard for those share customers and that share of wallet, share of mind. And make sure that your brand is in a good shape to engage your audiences. And the last one here is sort of it's a master key message project. And we've been working on this with a couple clients over the last few months. If you've got an organization that has a number of spokespeople, or if you have people spread out, you want to make sure that people have that same song sheet that they're singing from when they're talking about your organization or speaking on behalf of your organization. So work on compiling all of your key messages. And yes, there are the obvious ones of who are we, what do we do, why are we different, but also how do we stand on a variety of topics or issues. And then doing some tabletop exercises to plan for different scenarios or issues and plan your messaging for those. And it really will help out when those do emerge, that you've got a good tool for people to use. So looking at this kind of reopening, and curious to see what the Premier has to say at 3 o'clock today, and what kind of things are going to be reopening. But as we plan for reopening, I just want to come back to that IMI study that I started with. And as part of that, they also looked at tracking consumers' biggest fears during the pandemic. They found out that 54% of Canadians' biggest fear in the next 3 months is their personal health, and 21% say their biggest fear is personal finances. So those are two really big things that we're going to have in mind as we plan our communications. There are going to be big fears around health and safety, and also around spending. So keep that in mind as you plan your communications. Now, this graph below, they also asked what people's intention to attend was. So as we start to open up, how likely would you be to go to a sporting event, a concert, a community event, and events of different sizes. So the dark bar is Canada, and the lighter gray bar is the United States. And you can see that the numbers are quite different. And I personally didn't know that as many Canadians would be open to live sporting events as this data shows. But you can see that there isn't a huge huge appetite here for things like festivals, concerts, but there is a bit of a bright spot around outdoor events. So if you had events planned, or if events are part of your calendar, you may really want to take a look and see how you could explore outdoor events, because people are going to be feeling more comfortable if they're outdoors and if there's a bit more space. Also, just noting that communicating to your audience around how large your event is going to be, because the size of the event will probably factor in people's decision about whether or not to attend. So trying to get a handle on that and communicate that to your audience. So some considerations here, and it kind of goes without saying, but it's not going to be business as usual. So don't plan on going back to the same kind of communications that you were doing a few months ago. It's going to have to change. People are going to be nervous about going to public places, and people may be more price sensitive. You know, a lot of people have been really negatively impacted, and if they haven't, they might be aware just of a general economic slowdown to come. So it's going to be harder to engage people in more spending. And people will have established new patterns. So we've had a couple months now where you haven't been going to the same businesses that you always go to. So maybe people have started to drink coffee, or maybe they've given it up. Maybe they've changed their dietary habits. So we're going to have to work hard to help people establish new patterns, or to get back to visiting our businesses as part of their patterns. But there are some real opportunities. So for those who have been working at home and earning full salaries and haven't had as many ways to spend their income, they're going to have more disposable income to spend as we kind of get through this opening period. And some people are going to be very keen to get back out and have some fun experiences, to connect with people, to get back to dining and to some things that are more engaging and entertaining than staying at home. And some folks, I might count myself included in this one, are going to be tired of cooking and are going to be seeking some variety in their lives. So there are a lot of opportunities. People are going to want to get out, but there's a lot we're going to need to be aware of. So what needs to change in your communications going forward? And I would come back to this notion of getting to know your audience. So segment your audience and really figure out who needs to know what. What are the different groups in my audience, and what do I need to tell them, and how do I need to engage with them? And if you think about how different it's going to be to engage your internal audiences, your people, into getting back to work, especially into frontline roles, and then your customers and what they need to know about maybe coming back and engaging with our businesses. The nature of that relationship is really going to dictate how that communication needs to go. Now, the next one here around tone, I think, is going to be a big one for us all to try to figure out. We're going to need to try to find that balance between optimism and reassurance. So how much do we want to encourage people to come out and be inspired or have fun? And how much of our message needs to go back to reassuring people that it's safe? So it's going to be a bit of a dance. It's going to depend on your business. It's going to depend on what you're offering. But I think that's a line that we're all going to have to try to find over the next little while. So some tips here, I would say prepare for a range of scenarios. I think it's unlikely that things are going to get back to normal quickly, so it may be a slow build, so prepare for a small amount of business and to ramp up, but also prepare for scenarios that might happen, such as what happens if one of your employees gets COVID-19? How will you notify your customers? What messaging do you need? What tools do you need? What's the protocol? So that is one that everybody should be planning for. What happens if one of your customers has COVID-19 and has been into your business? So planning for these issues and these scenarios that hopefully we never need to use, but it would be a really good one to plan for. But in your communications, just keep it simple. Have been feeling really overwhelmed. Keep the messages tight. Keep it easy for people to find information and digest that information. And be aware of the range of attitudes about reopening. And I think there's going to be a lot of judgment here too. So there's going to be some folks who want to rush out and get their hair cut and get into a restaurant. And there are others who will think that that is inappropriate. And it may be surprising who has those attitudes. We need to understand that it is okay for everyone to have these opinions, but we just need to be sensitive to that range of attitudes as we navigate this really tricky time. And be prepared for pushback from some, and whether that pushback is from your employees or from your customers or from your neighbors, just have some messaging. Think about how you might answer some of those tough questions. But most of all, I would say be nimble. The environment that we're in right now is so different than what any of us has experienced before, and it is changing so quickly. So the more nimble you can be, I think the better the odds are that you're going to be able to seize some of these opportunities. When I look at London Drugs and their ability to be nimble, we're working on some campaigns with clients, and we're trying to do as much legwork as we can before, and then we're able to kind of chop and change as we go, as we find out more about how people react and what we're allowed to do. So be nimble, be ready to act quickly. But I guess I would like to end with what we've been hearing every day from Dr. Henry throughout this time. Be kind, be calm, and be safe. And I think if we keep those in mind, and if we're communicating that, and if that's how we're behaving with our audiences, I think we can't go too far wrong. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Charles. I guess we've got some time for Q&A, but just want to thank everyone for watching the webinar. And if there's, if you have any questions, hopefully we can get to all of them. And if not, happy to answer anything afterwards too.
Gwen, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I don't have to take notes. I was paying attention, and I think there's some great opportunities for us at the DVBA and how we can actually put that to work for us. So we do have some questions. Just to remind our participants that please submit your questions and via the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. I do have four right now, and I'll start with the first one. Can you give some tips around ad buying? Should we be continuing to put out brand messaging right now, or is it better to lay low?
So that one's a really interesting one. I actually talked with our media buyer about it and sort of the pros and cons of what people should be doing. And I think there is research that shows if you maintain your share of voice during a crisis, your business will bounce back faster afterwards. And so I think that's where you'll see there's so many brands right now that pulled their real hard sell messages and have gone with sort of feel good supporting messages. And whether it's car companies who are talking about working with people through their car loans and forgiving loans, or whether it's, IKEA talking about the value of home right now. They're not a hard sell message. They're sort of a feel good message, but it's getting the brand out there. So I think that if you have the resources to do it, if you had originally planned to have big buys, I would say keep them up. What is tough is to know whether or not, if you want to buy in time with a reopening. So we've been doing some research for clients. There are some really good bargains out there right now too. So if you do have to push, there's some really good rates. So I guess I would encourage people to have some good conversations with their media reps, and see how flexible the media organizations could be if you need to push your dates back, if you want that buy to be really tied in with, a reopening, and if you're not sure exactly when that's going to be. But there is value in keeping your share of voice during this time.
That's great. This one kind of related. What would you recommend as a social media strategy right now, i.e. balancing COVID and non-COVID post, tone, etc.?
That's a tricky one because you kind of worry about being tone deaf. And I think this is really going to depend on your brand, and it's going to depend on your audience. So knowing your audience and kind of knowing if it feels right for them. Your audience, 2/3 of people are tired of the COVID information. People are looking for other information, but just always being aware of people's headspace. So knowing that people are afraid, they're worried about money, they're worried about the world, but people also want to be engaged and entertained. So I think that I wouldn't shy away from engaging in some non-COVID content that's fun, but I think just really being aware of how that might land. And if you go wrong, step back quickly and address it. So if you've gone too far and if people say, that's super inappropriate, be humble, recognize that you made a mistake and learn from that.
Great advice. What's the outlook for newsrooms and media companies post-COVID? It seems like a lot of them are struggling right now. I think you've talked about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm worried about. And I know when you see an appeal from your community paper saying, would you consider donating? That's not something we're used to seeing. And that's where I would encourage, if you have the capacity, if a media outlet is important to you, if it's an outlet that you share with frequently, and if you can support them by buying an ad, I think supporting local news right now is important.
I think this is the next one is interesting. Is there anything that we can do in order to prepare for the second wave of the pandemic, of the virus?
Yeah, and this is the one that I think is really scary, because I think if you look at that graph of the Spanish flu and you see that first wave, I don't know if anyone saw the New York Times graph that went around a couple of weeks ago, and it shows the first wave and then the second wave and then third, and it shows us just at the top of that first wave. If we loosen the restrictions up too much and we end up with that second wave and go back to lockdown, I think that's going to be really hard for people to adjust to. And I think that's where we all have a role to play in being really responsible as things start to ease up. So let's go slow. Let's make sure we have all of the protocols in place, all the cleaning, all the barriers, that we're not letting too many people back into our businesses at once. Because I think it's going to be tough for all of us to navigate if we go back into a big second wave. So from a communication standpoint, I think we have to be nimble. None of us knows how this is going to play out, but I think the more responsible we can be, as we start to open up, hopefully it will mitigate, how much of this we see moving forward, and really take our cues from public health. I think the whole way along, just being really aware that we are following all of the guidelines from public health and being responsible with our businesses.
The next question, you kind of touched on this, but I think it might be worth getting a more in-depth response from you. What's the best approach to dealing with potential social media blowback from people who think we're reopening too soon? How can we support local businesses without wading into profits over people territory?
Yeah, now that one's really interesting. We had a post for a client that went up last week, and all the comments, it was kind of just a nod to sort of a reopening message. And there were a lot of comments that were along the lines of, no, this is too soon, this isn't responsible. But then on the flip side, the post itself had a lot of likes. And so I think that shows how the audience is very split. There are going to be people who are very supportive of reopening, and then there are going to be folks who are really opposed to it. And so I think we're going to see a bit of everything. I think ultimately, if we come back to that place of authenticity, and if we're following the public health advice, we don't want to get ahead of the public health advice. So if you can always point back to the fact that you are following the rules and the guidelines that officials have set out, I think you can feel more confident in what it is that you're doing. So going back, following that advice from officials, and just watching that the message isn't too much of a hard sell message, really kind of easing into it and recognizing that we've just been conditioned for 2 months to stay home. It's going to take a while for us to get comfortable being back out there. So it's okay for people to feel like that. And I think recognizing that that's normal, and it's going to be part of this journey that we're on.
I know a couple of calls that I've been on, I can't remember what Zoom call it was, to be frank with you. There is a lot of conversation about having kind of uniformity of messaging that goes out to the general public when they go back to the businesses. Maybe there's a certification program with a decal that gets placed in front of or in the window of a retailer or a restaurant. Maybe it's saying Dr. Bonnie Henry certified. And so there is some discussion that's happening amongst various groups, including the BIAs and others in the business community. I'd be curious to know if that's a good measure.
Yeah, I mean, third-party validation is always great. It's great to have something to point to and say, you know, I'm operating within these. I guess I just know how stretched all of our institutions are right now, and I really wouldn't want to layer in too much bureaucracy into the reopening process, because I think there's just so many different types of organizations. I think really they're going to set out those high level expectations and rules, and it's up to all of us to interpret those. And if I go back and I think about that, the process of closing down and how we were all kind of every day trying to figure out, well, does this mean my event is closing, and can we continue on with ours? And we were all trying to, you know, read between the lines and figure out, you know, what Dr. Henry was saying. And I think there's going to be a bit of that opening up. I think it's going to be, you know, how does my business, which doesn't quite fit into that specific box, interpret those rules? So I think it's going to be a little tricky. I don't know how smooth it's going to be for all of us to navigate. And again, if you can do some legwork in advance, and if you can just try to be nimble and just try to be authentic and, you know, genuine. I think that people have compassion for businesses. I think people know this isn't easy for, you know, both large and small businesses to try to navigate. So I think if we can just be authentic in our communication, I think it'll help.
Are the messages different to the customer than employees?
I think they are, because I think ultimately a customer can just decide to not frequent your business. If they want to not go out and buy a meal, that's fine. You know, they can cook for themselves at home. But for employees, about deciding to come back to work, you know, as we heard in some of your previous webinars, you know, is it a refusal to work, or do we need to accommodate people who have anxiety? There's a whole lot of scenarios there. And if an employee refuses to come back to work, what does that mean for their job and their livelihood? And people's attitudes range. I mean, some people are much more comfortable, and people are much more anxious. So I think for employees, you're going to need to do a lot more reassurance of how you're keeping them safe and opening up those lines of communication and responding to those fears as you get through kind of, if day one shows that, you know, people weren't feeling great, how are you going to change your protocols on day two? And I think as many people might feel, they've seen the changes happen in the grocery stores. You know, initially, it was, you know, don't bring your bags, and then the plexi went up, and then, okay, you can pack your own bags, and the plexi looks a little different everywhere. But those all changed, and I'm assuming in response to, you know, the public health rules, but also how employees were feeling about being back at work. So make sure you open up those lines of communications with your employees, because you don't want to be surprised by a lot of, you know, unhappy folks. You want to make sure that you have a really good finger on the pulse of what your employees are feeling as they come back to work and as you open back up.
So we still have some time for questions. I've been asking some from my own, but just to let the attendees know that we still have about 20 minutes. While we wait for more questions to come online, I was going to ask you, in your travels over the course of the last 8 weeks, being in semi-lockdown or working from home, are there some examples of companies that you think have done a really, really good job of communicating and reassuring customers?
Yeah, you know, I haven't been very many places. I have been stretching out my grocery visits. And we've done a few things around, you know, I was buying some books for my kids and curbside pickup. So that there's been folks who at our local kids bookstore here has been, you know, really making themselves available for reading material for kids in this time and changing their operations. I mean, I think, you know, London Drugs, that's been on one of my few shopping trips, I think they have done a good job. I think that they've had lots of extra staff on at the door, and I think you'll find the same thing at many of the grocery stores, but lots of staff out there to direct people. So having people, you know, explain the rules, and the rules did change kind of initially. So, you know, catching people off guard and explaining what the new rules were around spacing, about what you can and can't do. So I think that those organizations did a really good job quickly and at scale to roll those programs out and not really miss a beat. And, you know, when you take out all of our errands and what do we still need to do, we still needed to go and get groceries and get to the drugstore and those kinds of things. And I think those organizations have done a good job. I don't know how realistic some of the arrows on the floor are. You know, it's not how we're used to shopping and going in the kind of lines, but I think that they've been working really hard to try to do that. And I think actually what that speaks to is as we work around reopening, there's two things to consider. One is signage, and sort of what are the floor decals that you need? What are all the signage around like elevator occupancy and how many people in your business? So you're gonna need signage, and I would suggest that people get started on that stuff now. And you can always drop in, you can change the information. You don't have to go to print now, but get them designed, get them ready to go. But you're gonna need a mix of both physical signage and physical communication tools for people to engage with, and also people. So you're going to need people to explain those rules. I think we're doing a pretty good job of reading those signs, but we also do know that sometimes people just walk right by signs and don't even read them. So making sure that if we're limiting occupancy in space or we're encouraging lineups in certain ways, having those things down on the ground, really spelled out super simply and super clearly for people. Now, I think each brand may want to decide what do those tools look like for them. And they don't all have to look really clinical and really scary. You could have maybe a little bit more fun with color or fonts or make it feel on brand. But again, putting the physical pieces in place so that people, as people are engaging within our physical businesses, that there's a lot of cues that tell them where to be and how to behave. And that will keep them safe, and it will keep our people safe.
And that's a good point. We're actually doing a Zoom call on Friday with a number of business and building owners, commercial building owners, with Vancouver Coastal Health and City of Vancouver staff on the call to have a conversation about how do we practice physical social distancing in the office environment and in the common areas. So I think that's the next phase and the next conversation that has to happen. I know in the elevator in our building, and I am back in the office, they're saying maximum of 4 people per elevator, and there's a clear signage right at the elevator door.
Yeah, so I think that signage is going to be really important. I guess I would also just say, though, that some of the standard signage that I've seen out there that you can buy may not reflect your brand, and so may encourage you to develop some tools that feel right for your audience. So if your audience is used to seeing you communicating in a certain way, you may want to try to have some of those tools also reflect your brand, and that may help get people into more of that optimistic space and a little less of that clinical fear-based space.
I don't see any other questions. Gwen, you probably cut the conversation short by saying that the Premier was going to be on it with some kind of announcement about reopening up the economy. So I think with that, why don't we wrap it up? I want to thank Gwen for her time today and for fielding most of my questions and those from our membership. We truly appreciate your time and your support. To our participants today, you'll be receiving a follow-up survey via email this afternoon. And I did have a question about whether or not we'd be sharing the presentation, and the answer is yes. We appreciate hearing from you and hope that you'll find a few moments to fill out the survey and let us know how we did today. We'd also love to hear from you about topics that we can cover in future webinars. We have webinars scheduled till early June, but based on what I'm hearing, we may be doing some well into the month of June. So if you have any ideas, please let us know. Our next weekly webinar is next Wednesday, same time at 2 o'clock. We hope that you can join us for the next topic. Representatives from Deloitte will join us to talk about cash flow management and financing. So that's it for today. Again, thanks, Gwen, for your time and all the front end time that you put into your presentation. Very thoughtful and very communicative in your approach and giving some great examples that others can follow. So with that, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and tune into the Premier's address at 3 o'clock.
Thanks, Charles.
Okay, bye-bye.